Hello, this is Y490 Politics of the Internet. This lecture was originally delivered on March 21, 2012. The lecture concerns surveillance, defined as routine ways in which focused attention is paid to personal details by organizations that want to influence, manage, or control certain persons or population groups. It occurs for all kinds of reasons which can be located on a continuum from care to control. Some elements of care and some element of control are nearly always present, making the process inherently ambiguous. That's a quotation from David Lyon. Surveillance theory has developed over the years, perhaps starting with Jeremy Bentham's idea of a panopticon. You can see a picture of Jeremy Bentham on the upper right there. And the idea was to be able to see everything, basically. Panopticon means see everything. And that idea was applied originally to hospitals and prisons, which led to Michel Foucault's later work, Survey and Punish, which was about the commonalities between prisons and other kinds of institutions, such as insane asylums. And more recently, we have Gilles Deleuze from France talking, well, just like Foucault, talking about what he calls rhizomic surveillance, which is a kind of surveillance that kind of spreads like plants. It's everywhere. So a symbol of that is the cluster of video surveillance cameras that you can see on a tower pole. Such as you can see, for example, in downtown London and many other cities. In 2002, the Bush administration proposed a program called the Total or Terrorism Information Awareness Program in response to September 11. The program was headed by Admiral John Poindexter, who was originally tried and convicted on felony charges for his role in the Iran-Contra scandal and then pardoned, or I guess his conviction was reversed on appeal. Anyway, there's the logo for the program, and there's a picture of Admiral Poindexter. The function of the TIA was to use data gained from component technologies to create a large-scale national counterterrorism database, to populate the database and look for methods for mining, combining, and refining new sources to include in the database, to analyze and correlate information in the database to derive actionable intelligence. Here's a slide from one of the lectures at DARPA to explain the, at that time still called the Terrorism Information Awareness Program. Basically, what you need to get out of this is a combination of both private and public databases, together with official intelligence, to basically identify possible foreign terrorist threats abroad or foreign terrorist threats in the United States. The program was going to have a bunch of different components, some having to do with language translation, some having to do with war games, something having to do with biosurveillance and identification of human beings at a distance. There were a bunch of other kind of information technology programs associated with the research side of the Total Information Awareness program. So here's a little bit more detail. The Translingual Information Detection, Extraction, and Summarization program was supposed to help with translation, since one of the problems with September 11 is not enough people who spoke Arabic. Then there was the question of making public officials more familiar with the kinds of challenges created by the existence of terrorism and terrorists and the kinds of tactics that they use. Human ID at a distance is to use facial recognition technology, gait recognition, and other kinds of means to identify people from photographs that are taken at some distance. There's also the biosurveillance aspect, which was to deal with problems having to do with biological attacks, such as the anthrax attacks that occurred in the wake of September 11th. So this slide does a little bit of explaining the human ID at a distance, and we saw a little bit of an example of this in the recent efforts to catch the bombers at the Boston Marathon. Not entirely successful, but aided by the fact that not only did they have security camera data, but also people's photographs from mobile telephones and so forth. We also have other programs connected with the TIA, such as dealing with very large databases, creating a classified Wikipedia, and trying to use graph theory to figure out who was connected to whom in terrorist organizations. Here's an example of a prototype program that was supposed to inspire the TIA, where basically they used phone calls and other kinds of communications to link various people with Arabic names who might have been plotting against the U.S. And you can see that one of the names on this list is Mohammed Atta, who actually was one of the terror plotters. This is another slide explaining the TIA, which talks about the kinds of ways that data could be linked together to identify potential terrorists or potential actions by terrorists and ways to deal with them. One of the key objections to the TIA came from civil libertarians. They were remembering some of the earlier intelligence programs, such as the COINTELPRO counterintelligence program of the 1960s, in which the FBI abused the privacy rights of anti-war and civil rights activists under the name or under the excuse that they were protecting national security. J. Edgar Hoover himself was kind of crazy about Martin Luther King and the possibility that Martin Luther King was inspired by Soviet communism and specifically by Soviets to do what he was doing. There are many problems with protecting individual privacy rights connected with data mining, particularly data mining of data collected by commercial businesses as opposed to the U.S. government. Within the U.S. government, there was supposed to be a kind of separation between different government databases to make it impossible to do sort of random searches of innocent individuals without warrants from judges of the federal courts. Data mining itself was a new technology of the period. We had gone from simple data collection to advanced methods to provide data access. Then very large amounts of data were collected in what were called data warehouses, supported by decision support software. And then in the last decade and a half or so, we saw a bunch of companies developing ways to handle data in massive databases to provide important and timely information to managers. So the big problem, one of the other big problems besides the privacy issues is the fact that, so one of the purposes of the TIA was to develop a list of potential terrorists. And the question is, who should be on that list? Sometimes you get people on the list who shouldn't be there, and sometimes you miss people who should be there. Identifying people who are on the list but not really terrorists is called a false positive. And so here's an example of a farmer who is picking up some fertilizer after his trip to the Holy Land. So you might consider him to be the same as a terrorist infiltrating the U.S. to place a truck bomb at, for example, the Golden Arches. The ACLU was one of the key organizations that raised these questions about the TIA, and they also raised the issue of what's called mission creep, where you start off trying to find Al-Qaeda and similar types of terrorists, and you then figure out, well, I can do this to do all kinds of other things, and I'll just do that without getting sufficient authorization from the President or Congress. A sort of broader question is whether these kinds of programs, these particularly the data mining programs, go against the legal tradition of presumption of innocence. So the whole idea is that you had to justify search under the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. The search and seizure clauses say that you must have some kind of reasonable expectation that somebody has committed a crime before you start collecting information on them. DARPA's views were that the TIA was not a domestic surveillance program, that it would have a built-in audit control system, and that it could use technology basically to protect privacy, and that eventually that technology would do the things that were necessary to make sure that individual privacy rights weren't guaranteed. So they basically you hear the same arguments with respect to the recent authorization to the National Security Agency to collect internet usage data from large U.S. companies. Basically, the idea is saying that we're not going to listen in on your phone calls unless you're calling a member of Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia or something like that. So the arguments that were used with respect to TIA are actually being repeated more recently with this revelations by Edward Snowden. The TIA was killed, luckily, although many of the ideas continued on to live into the present. The TIA was eventually shot down because there was no guarantee that it would not be used for domestic surveillance. It didn't look like the privacy protections that were originally conceptualized were adequate. There were no defined limits on the databases that the TIA would be able to access. And I think the biggest factor was the choice of Admiral Poindexter, who kind of came to this program with a lot of baggage from the Iran-Contra days. Here's a list of programs that were associated with government counterterrorist data collection and mining programs at that time. Some of them basically ended in 2004 with the end of the TIA proposal, but some of them continued on into the present, such as, for example, SEVIS, SEVIS, which is a program whereby universities have to report to the federal government on exchange students and foreign visitors who are in the country for the purpose of attending schools. So all universities have to comply with the rules behind this program. So as I said before, there's the problem of false positives was a big issue behind the canceling of the TIA. The inability to address privacy concerns, the non-transparent combination of classified and open source data, the general lack of transparency in most of the research programs, and the possibility for mission creep. The legal environment for warrantless wiretaps was also an issue at that time, and has continued on into the present with the more recent scandal connected with Edward Snowden's leaks of information about the NSA programs. You will see in all of that much attention paid to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, which obviously precedes September 11 events. The FISA Act set up a court which was supposed to oversee wiretaps and other kinds of surveillance. In 1994, we saw an expansion in the ability of law enforcement to monitor communications, called the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. This was very much inspired by the attack on the World Trade Tower of the early 1990s, and also the bombing in Oklahoma City. In 2003, we saw the Domestic Security Enhancement Act, or the Patriot Act, which has been reauthorized several times. You'll note that more recently, President Obama appointed a fellow who was involved in the March 2004 efforts by Attorney General Gonzalez and Vice President Cheney, the domestic policy advisor Andrew Card, and Mr. Gonzalez before he was Attorney General, to get Attorney General John Ashcroft, who was in the hospital, to continue authorization for warrantless wiretaps. That the authority had expired, and they were trying to revive it. Story was leaked in a USA Today story and also in the New York Times in 2006 that there was a huge National Security Agency phone call database. So the 2007 version of the Patriot Act was the Protect America Act. It amended the FISA law to remove requirement for warrants for certain types of wiretaps, made the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence responsible for authorizing warrantless searches, and reauthorized aspects of the Patriot Act that were expiring. So there's a fairly big fight between the Democrats and the Republicans on this, but the Republicans prevailed. There were further amendments to the FISA Act in 2008, giving telecommunication firms immunity for past cooperation with federal intelligence and law enforcement agencies. And those of you who've been following the recent controversy will see that that was where Verizon and other telephone companies, AT&T also, were sort of given the go-ahead to continue to provide data to the NSA, the FBI, and other agencies. Russ Feingold was a major opponent of this, and you can Google him or search for him on YouTube to see what he said about it at the time. In the Obama administration, you can see that there's been a continuation of some of these practices. In 2011, President Obama signed the bill that reauthorized key elements of the Patriot Act, and this was not very popular among his liberal supporters, and become even less popular with the recent revelations.